Welcome to Lab this week. We are going to be taking a look at Visual Basic for applications and macros and actually get into programming today. So I hope that this is exciting. We're going to actually be writing some code and running some programs and taking a look at that side of Excel today. So a brief overview of where we're going to actually head through this lab. First thing we have to do is set up Excel and get you started because we're getting into, we're graduating from a basic level in using Excel to more being a power user. So there's some things we're going to have to turn on and some modifications we're going to have to make to Excel to allow us to write code. Next, we'll do just a quick spreadsheet on binary and do some calculations there just to reinforce and make sure that you have a good understanding of binary and how it works. Next, we're going to write a custom function, which is something I showed in the lecture last week. And just because that's something powerful that's a very simple and easy thing to do that can open up a number of doors and opportunities for you in what Excel can do. Next is just text output, because that's just a pretty simple, we're going to really, with that example, we're going to write our first actual program that will run kind of as a standalone. It's not just little bits of code in the custom function, but will be a program that we can run, and the text output is just a very simple example of that. The next example will be actually taking input from a spreadsheet, and then outputting data to that same spreadsheet. So I mentioned in the lecture that one of the powerful things about VBA, and the reason that you would use VBA over any other programming language, is because of the integration with Excel. So we'll just take a brief look at what you can do. And I want to highlight that it is brief. There are a million more powerful and maybe more interesting things that we can do, but just that we don't really have time or bandwidth to do in this course. So I'll just do a quick, simple input and output example. And then finally, I have mentioned multiple times that one of the more powerful aspects of Excel and VBA is automation of tasks. So we'll do a quick and fairly simple, but I think a good example that will get you headed in the right direction if you need to do this in the future. First thing we need to do to get set up to write some code in Excel is to open a new workbook and save as a macro enabled workbook, and call this lab 3. So there we go. Now the reason that we have to do that is if we don't have a macro enabled workbook, then Excel won't know that there's code that needs to be run. So that also lets you know when you open the file whether or not there's code that could run that actually could be malicious. And so that's, I think, one of the main reasons that Microsoft has had created two different file types for a standard Excel sheet versus a macro-enabled Excel sheet that can run programs. All right, so that was step 1. Step 2 is to go to File Options and the Customize Ribbon section right here. And what you should see is a Developer tab here. You need to check that box, click OK, and now you should see is a Developer tab. And there's a Visual Basic button and Macros button, a Record Macros. Those are probably the 3 buttons that we're going to use most frequently. So right now there are no macros because I haven't recorded any or written any. And if I hit the Visual Basic button, this is related to the actual ribbon. It's not any code that we need to worry about. So if that does pop up for you, just go ahead and close it. So this right here on the left is the tree for lab 3, so the file that we're working with. And you can see there's 2 objects here, sheet 1 and this workbook. So right now we are dealing with sheet 1. So this is a separate window entirely from the Excel workbook. So I'm going to hit Alt Tab and switch back. So now I'm back in the workbook. But between those 2 windows, this is where you do the Excel work, and this right here is where you're going to do the coding work. So we need to have those 2 things set up. So quick review, one would be saving as macro enabled workbook. 2 is adding the developer tab to your ribbon. If you have issues with either of those 2 things, just let me know. The different versions of Excel have the options at different places, so you should be able to find it. If not, I would start with a Google search and type in the version of Excel you have, and there should be some instructions available for that. But if you do have issues, feel free to reach out to me or other students even to get this part of it sorted, because if you can't do this, then you can't proceed. So hopefully you can get this part of it figured out quickly and early in the week, so we've got plenty of time to complete the lab. One more note here before we get into the actual lab. One of the first things I'd like you to do once you open up a module to code is to type in the text option explicit, and this will force all of your variables to be explicitly declared. And you can go to the link on the bottom to read more about it. Basically, it will help you troubleshoot and prevent errors. So it's just a really good best practice to follow. Next up is writing a custom function. So what we're actually going to do is just work through the example I showed in the lecture last week. So let's see if I can remember what all I had. So we looked at area. So we're going to have x1 and x2, and we're actually going to calculate the area, then we're going to show the formula. So let's just pick a few random numbers, equals area, typos matter. So we're going to use the function product to just calculate the area, because we know that to calculate the area of a rectangle, it's the product of the length and width. So I've labeled these x1 and x2 just because that's how the product function works. It's x1, x2, x3, xn, however many data points you have. Copy the, nope, that didn't work. I'm just going to copy and paste the equation. And to do this, you have to put a single apostrophe at the front, and then it will keep it as text. Or another way to do that is you change the data type to text, and then you paste your text, and you'll notice that it keeps the formula and doesn't actually calculate it, which is perfect. What we want to do. So now I want to calculate the area. This should be product of a rectangle, same numbers, and I'm going to define my function with 2 inputs. The problem is that Excel doesn't recognize that name, so we need to fix that. Well, there you go. So now we've got our equations. So the only problem that we have is we don't actually have our function defined yet. So there's 2 ways to get to the actual Visual Basic code. One is to come to the Developer tab and click the Visual Basic button, as I did previously, or you can hit Alt F11 to what I prefer to do because it's faster. Now to insert a function, you have to go to insert a module. So what showed up here in the tree is now module 1. And we are going to define a function, and I want this to be accessible in the entire workbook. So the scope is going to be public, and this is a function. So per the VBA syntax, you have to declare first declare the scope, then you declare the type of procedure. And for reference, let's do it a couple different ways. We'll type this one, then we'll go ahead and insert it next. X as a double, Y as a double. So this is an explicit. All right, this is the first time we're typing code, right? So let's make sure I cover all the bases. So what I'm doing here, when you have a function, the variable in a function, so this is an input, you don't actually type. Normally what you would do is, that's giving me an error. We'll get back to that. Normally what you would do is type dim x as double, for example. But when you're declaring it in a function, you don't actually need to do that. Except I'm getting an error, so let's just make sure I'm right. Oh, I know what the issue is. So as I mentioned on the compiler slide, when you actually go to type in code, so Excel will check it as soon as you click off of that line, which is what I just did. It's giving me an error. There's an identifier issue. So sometimes the compiler error information is useful, and sometimes it's not terribly helpful. What I wish that it told me right now is that I need to have a name for my function. So now I have a name, and now I have parentheses that are the inputs, and then as double here is defining the output type. So now you see it changed the capitalization, and it didn't give me an error, so it looks good. Also, it recognized that that's a function, so it has added the end function, and I have to type my code now between the start of the function and the end of the function. Okay. All right, so we want to have our calculation. Should be pretty easy. X times Y, and that's it. I'm going to save my file. Make sure you do save periodically. I'm going to come back here and calculate, and it worked like magic. Look at that. So there we go. We have 4 times 7 as a product and 4 times 7 as an area. So next we're going to do a simple text output example where we can, and this is really going to be, so this is just from a coding perspective, this is really going to be the first program that you're running. So it's not a function, but it's going to actually be a program that you'll run by clicking a button. So I hope you're excited. It's going to be awesome. And honestly, it should be pretty easy. This is a simple one. So since we're going to be writing a program, we're going to go into the VBA editor, and just a quick reminder, you can do that by clicking this Visual Basic button, or you can hit Alt F11, or since I've got these two windows open, you can just hit Alt Tab, which is what I'm doing. Okay, so I want to have a program that is executable, which kind of generally in Excel that's defined as a macro, but not all code in Excel is a macro. So generally I see a macro as something that is something you can record or run to make Excel work better, work faster, do some calculations you can't do or something like that. So let's go ahead and create it. So we're going to start with a new module. So I'm going to do a new module because this section of code. I don't want that to actually be related to this function over here. But because it needs to be able to run on any of these worksheets which are outside of this module, I need to make it public. So we're going to do it the easy way. Last time we typed all the code in by hand. We're going to insert a procedure, give it the name text output so that we know what it's for. It's a sub rather than a function, so because this is going to be a code that we run, and there's not going to be any output, I'm going to make it public so that it's accessible by the other sheets, and there we go. That was much easier. So best practice here, whenever you write code, you really should comment. We didn't do it last time, but going to do it this time. So first thing that you should put in your comments is what the program is about. So this program is or will output text onto the screen. Another good thing to do is to put the date, October 8th, 2018. This is written by Tim Burdett. There you go. So those are just some good information to include in your comments when you write program. Because of how VBA works, you would put it in whatever your top level code is if you have it. So the first thing we're going to do, I want to define or declare a variable. So what I want to do is I want to output text on the screen. So I'm going to actually make this a variable. So dim string as, dim the message as a string. So far, Excel hasn't given me any error messages, so I'm doing pretty good. Next, I'm going to assign the message or text to variable message. And there's not really a lot of rules on the comments. It's more of an art form, I would say. So, but you just want it to be clear and consistent. So message equals, that's the syntax for assigning information or data to a variable. And if it's going to be text, it needs to be in quotation marks on either side. And we want to see the message hello world on the screen. Now I'm going to print the message to the screen. And if you had to, you could just Google what the function is to do this. But I'm just going to tell you it's MSGBOX, which is short for message box. And this function, which is specific to VBA, you couldn't use it in a spreadsheet. It works just like functions in Excel. So you start with the name, then you put parentheses, and then you put whatever arguments or inputs you need into it. So we're just going to put message box message hello world, and that's the end of the code we need. So I just went ahead and saved. So now we're going to come back here, and so what we've done now is we've coded we've put together our program, which is a procedure, a sub that doesn't have any inputs or outputs in this case. And now I need to somehow get this bit of code to run. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a form control, which all of these are buttons that can interact with the code or macros running in the background. So I've added this button. What I want it to do is to pull up the text output macro, and we're good. I'm going to edit the text. Doesn't work. Don't hit Control A to select all the text. Edit text. Say hello VBA. Alright, so I'm going to ask VBA or Excel to say hello, and Microsoft Excel said hello world. There we go. So that was your very first program. I hope that went smoothly. This next example is going to take a look at input and output, which the idea here is that we're actually going to take information from a spreadsheet and do a little work on it and then output it back out. This would be something you would do if you wanted to do some calculations on some data that you've imported maybe. The example we've got for this is a pretty simple one, but will, I think, show the idea because really as I've mentioned before, the power of VBA is how it can sit on top of Excel and use what you can already do in Excel. So what I'm going to do is I've copy and pasted some inputs in. So I've got 6 inputs that are some text inputs, one that we've already used, and then a few other nerdy quotes that I thought were pretty entertaining. And next what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a program that will roll the dice to choose to have a number between 1 and 6, and we'll choose between which of these cells to read in and then output back out. So we're going to take the same approach as we did previously. So I'm going to hit Alt F11, there we go, get to the code. And I'm going to do the same thing here, insert a new module, keep this separate. And this module, or this sub procedure that I'm going to write, I'm going to call it input output to sub public so that we can run it on the sheet. This program from Excel sheet output one of the values. Okay. So that's what the program is going to do. We're going to declare variables, and we're going to have 2. One is dice, as I'm going to actually use an integer because it's going to be 1 to 6. And then the message that is chosen as a string. Now the first thing we need to do here, so we're, as I mentioned, going to quote roll some dice and get one of those quotes as an output. So really the algorithm for this would be fairly simple. First step would be to roll the dice. The second step would be to read in the input that correlates to that dice roll. And the last step would be to output that to the screen, or to the sheet in this case. So here we go, roll the dice. So there's a function that makes this pretty easy. Worksheet function ran between 1 and 6. So I had to do a little bit of research to figure the right way to do this, but basically any function that you can do in Excel. I'm going to take a break from VBA and just take a look at Excel. So we can do function random, which is just a random number between 0 and 1, and every time you update, I'm hitting F2 and enter to recalculate. It's just a number, decimal number between 0 and 1. What I actually want is something like rolling the dice. So there happens to be a function like this. And I want to get a random number between 1 and 6. 6, 4, 5, 1, right? So this is similar to what you'd get when you're rolling the dice. But I like to do this in VBA rather than in here on the sheet. Part of the reason is because anytime you update any cell, so if I hit F2 and enter on any cell, it will recalculate. Maybe not. Yeah, there we go. Now it's working right. And I must have just gotten a bunch of 3s in a row because that's how random works. Okay, so yeah, anytime you update any cell, it recalculates this, but I actually want to control when the dice is rolled. So I don't want to actually be tied to the default of Excel worksheet. So I'm going to call it here. So the way to call a function is worksheet function and then type a period, and if you noticed it gave me a number of options. I'm just going to do it again here. Worksheet function period. So this gives me all of the functions that are on a worksheet that I can use. If you know what it starts with, you can start typing it. Rand, so I could use the rand between. Should be able to use rand as well. In any case, that's how it works. And then once you have the function there, it works just the same as the function would in the spreadsheet. So now when this is executed, I have rolled the dice and that number is assigned to dice. So next I want to read the input associated with the dice roll. Technically, the singular of dice is die, but that sounds a little morbid, so we're going to use the plural form, even though it's technically incorrect. So dice is rolled. Now we're going to write our message. So the way to read a value of a cell or group of cells is what I'm typing right here. So range of, so we got our message and that equals, so we're assigning the value here. And I need to figure out what cell the dice is, so that is B9. And when you reference a cell, it's text, and so it needs to be in quotation. And that got me here. Okay, so now I've got the message assigned, so now I just need to assign it back to the output cell, which is B10. No, I didn't do that right. So the message is going to equal the range of B and the value of dice. So because this is not in quotation, that's not going to take it as a string, it's going to take it as a variable, which is dice. This and sign is concatenate. If you remember from lab 2, there were 2 ways to concatenate strings, and this is the easy way, so that's what I've chosen to use. And now we should be ready to go. Oh, you know what? I'd also like to output the dice roll and the message so that I know what the roll was. This is where I want B9 to equal dice. Perfect. Okay. Now we're just going to run this and see if it works like we think. There we go. Rolled a 4 and got input 4. It's more like a big ball of wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff. I'm just going to center that so it's easier to see. So now we have our code or program that we can run. Now it's a question of how do we get this to run on command. So we could do a button like last time, but I'd like to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to get my input-output macro or program that I've written. I'm going to edit it. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's do it again. Rather than edit, I want to hit options for input and output. So now I can have a shortcut key. So I'm going to hit Control D. I can have a description of what this does. This runs the input output program. Record what the shortcut is here. Control plus D. Now if I hit Control D, it's going to roll the dice again. So that's a simple, fast way to roll the dice and get just some simple interaction with data on a spreadsheet. All right, we are almost done with the lab. This is going to be the last tab that we're going to create. So what I've done here is I've actually taken the calculation we did in last week's lab and pasted it in here. So what I'd like you to do the same. So we already know how to copy a tab over, but because there are named cells on this worksheet, you can't copy it. So because Excel won't let you have two worksheets open that have the same variable names. So what you actually have to do is, I'll walk through you how to do it right now. So this is my lab 2. I have my numeric optimization tab. Now rather than copy, which is normally what we would do, we'd normally check this box for create copy. Don't do that. You're going to go ahead and move it to lab 3. And after you do that, it'll show up. I'm going to hit cancel because I've already done it. And then close. Go ahead and hit close. And don't save, so that when you reopen it, you'll have that tab back in that worksheet. So now what you see is I have the variable names here. If you don't do that right, you won't have the variable names, and it won't calculate properly, which is what we need to do. So what I showed you last time was just how to implement this set of equations, which are pretty complex, but fairly powerful once you understand and can use them to perform calculations. And we did a goal seek to solve these equations because it's not something you can solve analytically. So the challenge with that is that if I am changing any of these numbers, so I'm going to change all my inputs. I'm going to actually, I realized that I need to have more flow. I need to have 500 GPM, but my flow rate, and to do that, I'm also going to get a larger diameter for that flow rate. And when I get the larger diameter, the roughness parameter is actually higher. So now it's 0.1. So what that's done is now my equation is unbalanced, and I need to do this goal seek again. But I don't want to have to do this every time I'm changing the design a little bit. Okay, so the question is, how do we let Excel do this work for us? So this is where the power of recording macros comes in. So what I've done so far is I've actually just walked you through how to create a program in Excel. Now what we're going to do is we're going to record a macro. And the steps that we're going to do is we're going to record the goal seek. So I'm going to call this automate goal seek because that's just awesome. So I'm going to have Control Shift G. No, we want to loop G. Control G to run this. Actually, we don't need that. I forgot. I'm going to show you a third way to run a macro. This macro will calculate or perform goal seek for me. Great. So now I'm recording, but I can move my mouse around all day. It's not going to record that. What it will record is scrolling, and that'll show up in the code, which is a little bit annoying because it just clutters up the code. But for some reason, you actually might want to record that. So every time you click, in general, it's going to record what you're doing. So I want this to get back to 0, so I need to click on the Data tab, What If, Goal Seek, set this cell equal to 0 by changing this cell. Now these notes were pretty handy in helping me do that again. Hit OK, and OK. Goal seek worked. It's now 0, and now I'm going to come back to the Developer tab and hit Stop Recording. All right, so it worked as far as I know. Let's go ahead and check on the code. So macros are all stored here in modules, and when you record a new macro, it's stored in a new module, which is good to keep them distinct. So for some reason, Excel didn't tab the comments over. I think that makes it easier to look at. So the name of this is Automate Goal Seek Macro, and it will perform goal seek for me. That's great. Those comments are helpful. Now, active window scroll. So if you want to learn a little bit about VBA and the integration with Excel, you can always just record whatever you're doing, and you'll learn a lot about the code. So all of these commands are scrolling 2, 1, 2, 3, 4 items up, and we don't need that. Also, this application copy mode false, we don't need. Honestly, I'm not sure why it's there. Add some space to make this look clean. Perform goal seek. Set cell D19 equal to 0 by changing cell, and lots of typos, by changing cell D16. So that's what this line of code does. And whenever you record a macro, there's usually going to be lots of extra code that you can get rid of, and you want to find the core of what you're trying to do. So now we've got our code to do the goal seek. Now that we have this bit of code, let's do just the first thing. The whole reason we do modules is so that we can do checks on individual modules. So let's see if I change this back to 0.01, say 1.5, 300. Now this is not non-zero again. So what I want to do, I'm going to come here and I want to run this macro, see if it worked, and this is 0 again, and it changed my friction factor. So that's a good sign. That means that the macro that we wrote works. Now it's a question of how do we get this macro to update. So far I've shown you how to create a button to run a macro, how to use a shortcut to run a macro, and now I'm going to show you a third way. And what I want to do here is show you how to do it, and we'll get into the details of what's going on with the code. Actually, when we look at C++, we'll get into some of the logic that's going on to do this. And there's some specifics for VBA, but basically what I want you to do is you can just copy and paste this code and just follow the steps that I'm doing. So what I want to do is I want to monitor and say whenever this cell is updated, then we're going to recalculate. And because I'm monitoring that specific worksheet, I want to update. So this is the sheet 7 code, which is automation. And I'm just going to put in this code. So it's private sub, and it's worksheet change. So you'll notice up here it says worksheet change. So this is a sub that is monitoring the worksheet change, and the input is variable target, which is a range. So if, and this is what's changed. So this is an if statement, which as I mentioned, we'll get into the details of some of this later. It's comparing the target, which is the change, to range. In this case, B19 is this cell. Is nothing. So if this cell didn't change, or excuse me, if this cell did change, the way that it's written is interesting. Then go ahead and run, but we're not going to run goal seek. We are going to automate goal seek because that's way cooler. Okay, there you go. So you put this text in. A lot of these things you can just go ahead and Google and find code to help you do whatever task you're trying to do in VBA. I mean, just kind of big picture, as we learn more tools and principles of programming, then it'll be, I think, it'll be easier and easier for you to use VBA. VBA is a fairly simple code to learn and use overall, where some other codes have more of a steeper learning curve up front. So this one's pretty simple, and I think once we get the principles, it'll be easier for you to pick up more in the future. So, all right, now let's see if this worked. So I'm going to update this cell, no changes, nothing's happening. But if I update and change this back to 0.1, it updated this cell and it ran goal seek. And my friction factor has been updated to keep this at 0. So there you go, that function in code worked, and that is another way that you can trigger a code. And so anything that you can dream up. One of the things that I toyed about doing in this lab was actually creating a report, because you can automate report generation with macros. It just wasn't a good clean example that I could put together in the time I had. But I think that this is just a good simple start at recording macros, and should really serve you well as you look at using Excel and VBA and macros in the future to do solid engineering.